Can you fill us in on what you think about all these news reports that we're hearing at this point? A lot of headlines that are out there today suggesting that the deal we thought we had is still a long way from being finalized before we can even call this the first phase of the deal. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't pay too much attention to all the daily headlines that speculate things one way or another. What I will tell you is we made substantial progress last week in the negotiations. We have a fundamental agreement. It is subject to documentation, and there's a lot of work to be done on that front. But it includes intellectual property rights. It includes financial services. It includes currency and foreign exchange. And it also includes very significant structural issues in agriculture, on top of significant purchases. So I would describe phase one as quite substantial. As the president has said, as soon as we get phase one complete, we'll move to phase two.
The one substantial thing that we've seen, the concrete thing that we've seen, is that the additional tariffs that were due to be imposed on October 15th have been put off by our side. Is there anything that you can concretely say that this is also going to be done by the Chinese as a result of this, or does everything still need to be finalized on paper?
No, China has agreed on agriculture that they're going to take off tariffs on agriculture and they're going to start purchasing agriculture. And they had been in the market, but they'll be stepping that up. But we'll be working very closely with them over the next few weeks to try to get this agreement to a signing in Chile.
One of the things I'd read over the weekend in terms of those agricultural purchases is that the Chinese side already seems to be laying some conditions to that, saying that any purchases would have to align with the need of Chinese companies or state-owned businesses, that they didn't think it would be fair to be asked to divert purchases from other countries like Brazil in order to make these purchases. And this is rich. They also think that it should be up to WTO standards to not affect or influence any of those markets. Was that your understanding in terms of what they'd be doing from an agricultural buy point?
Well, we did not discuss specifically whether they're diverting sales or not diverting sales. That's obviously up to them. We did discuss very specific targets. They're very big targets. I think they had some concerns as to whether our farmers could meet those numbers. We think they can. But we expect this is a great deal for our farmers.
I'm guessing you mean the $50 billion that they had agreed to, at least that's our understanding of it. Was that an up to $50 billion, like when a company says it's going to buy up to $5 billion in stock, back in stock, or is that your idea that these targets would be targets that they would hit?
It's 40 to 50 billion, and that's the range that we would expect them to hit, although there is some scaling up to get to that given the amounts.
Mr. Secretary.
And again, short-term scaling.
Short-term scaling. Let's talk a little bit about the additional tariffs for December 15th that are also still being threatened to be imposed by the United States. If there is not a deal that's reached between now and then, would those tariffs take place if there's not a deal that's actually signed?
I have every expectation if there's not a deal, those tariffs would go in place, but I expect we'll have a deal.
What else can you tell us? I know you had laid out that there were things like intellectual property and some other issues that were that were negotiated during this. What can you tell us about the overall structure and what you think will actually take place?
Well, I think, we've always talked about there's multiple chapters. So in this case, we've closed out several of the chapters. In the case of services, we broke it into a financial services and non-financial services. The financial services will close out this time. The rest of the services we'll deal with in phase two.
Meaning closed out, meaning that's not going to be renegotiated?
Meaning closed out, we've reached a fundamental agreement, and now it's subject to making sure the document reflects that.
How do you think that this will be enforced? What are your assurances there?
Both sides have absolutely agreed to that there needs to be a dispute resolution and that it needs to have real enforcement mechanisms. It's something we've talked about extensively, and I expect that the agreement we signed does have a dispute and enforcement provision.
My understanding of those enforcement provisions in the past and the real sticking points came that the United States wanted to be able to basically unilaterally decide whether China was agreeing with this. China wanted to make sure they had a seat at the table, too. What's your understanding now of what that enforcement mechanism would look like?
Well, we've developed a very extensive process. There's still a few words that need to be agreed on. I'm not going to go through the specifics of how the enforcement works, but what we have talked about before is that both sides will set up large offices to deal with these issues. And my expectation is that most of these issues will be dealt with from USTR and from China before it gets to actually an enforcement process.
But can I just ask again? I realize you may not be able to tell me every word or the few words that are being negotiated there, but would this be an enforcement mechanism where the United States would have the upper hand or where the two sides would sit jointly at the table?
I know you want the specifics of the chapter, and I'm not going to go through it, but what I will assure you is that it will have an enforcement mechanism that we can enforce and that we're comfortable with.
Does it sound to you, to me at this point, it sounds like we have agreed to not continue to escalate tensions between the two sides. But it does sound like there's still quite a ways that before we get to some sort of a deal that we can say this is an actual deal.
No, I don't think that's fair at all. There's a fundamental agreement in principle. We've gone through these chapters many times. There are still some issues that need to be worked out in wording, but I would say we have every expectation that phase one will close.